Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Today we welcome back Dr. Britt Kerwin, Chancellor Emeritus of the University of Maryland System. He's a nationally recognized authority on the critical issues facing higher education, having served as Chancellor of the Maryland System for 13 years, President of Ohio State University for 4 years, and President of the University of Maryland College Park for 10 years. Well, Britt, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. My encore performance.
The encore performance. Now we're going to get into the meat of it. It's like, Good. Okay, we've talked about all the problems and why, we've questioned the sanity of every president who's ever applied for the job. So now we're going to start off with some of the factors that have led to the shorter presidencies. We've talked about what a difficult job it is, and obviously those things lead to it. But even starting with the whole process of bringing on a new presidency, there's all sorts of pitfalls and potholes with that.
Absolutely. I think we have a flawed process for finding presidents. The typical thing is you hire a search consultant, you have a screening committee that's representative of the university, you get a pool of candidates and you narrow it down, and then you bring these candidates in for an interview. And the interview will last anywhere from, an hour to an hour and a half. Based on that interview, and of course, recommendations and some due diligence on the digging, but the interview is such a critical part of this process. And the thing about an interview is it gives a premium to glitz and glibness, not to substance. Because, I just remember being interviewed or sitting in when presidents were being interviewed, be a board, 15 to 20 people, candidates walk in, each board member gets to ask one question because there's not enough time to do more. And you go around the room and they all ask a question. And somebody gives, these little short answers to these various questions. And then based on that, plus, yes, letters of reference and other things, but primarily on the interview, they make a decision. And it's somebody of real substance who's done great things and who would be perfect fit the institution, maybe doesn't have the greatest day or whatever. Words don't come out quite right on that occasion and whatnot. Well, forget them. They're not going to make it. So I think that's one factor.
But aren't the interview processes, aren't they getting longer and longer in multiple groups? Bringing candidates in to speak with faculty.
Well, they are, but the board makes the final decision.
Yes, of course.
And, the board will hear what the other groups say and listen to them, but they're going to make their mind up in large part based on what they see during their interview. Mm-hmm. Another thing, would be true for candidates who have not been a president before. Let's say they've been a provost. A lot of universities, particularly public universities, like the idea maybe of looking at the provost of Harvard or MIT or something as a candidate for a position. And, I think the nature of the presidency and the expectations of the presidency make it very hard to assess whether or not someone who has not been a president will be an effective president. Look, if you want to find a good dean, you look for a good department chair, and it's more or less the same job, just a bigger platform. If you want to find a good provost, well, who's been a good dean? You're doing the same thing, but now it's campus-wide. And there really isn't the role of being the face and voice of the institution in the public eye. That is just who can do that effectively and do it in a way that advances the institution. That is very hard to judge unless you've seen someone play that role.
Well, a head football coach would be a great candidate for that, wouldn't he or she?
Well, yeah. I think my father was a good example.
I would say so. Jim Tressel as well.
Yeah, went from football coach to president of my alma mater. But then I think there's one other factor that I think makes the selection process, and challenges the selection process, and that is the over-reliance, in my opinion, on search consultants. I understand the need for search consultants. They can play a valuable role. But I think too often, in my experience, universities and search committees, et cetera, just sit back and see what the search consultant will bring to them. Individuals appointed to the search committee, if it's done well, are the ones that know the institution best. They have contacts all over the country. And this should be the source, the primary source or a major source of candidates for the presidency. So I think oftentimes universities are too passive in building the pool of candidates for the presidency.
I can easily see that, especially with the way for public universities, the way board members are appointed, usually by the governor or the legislature or something like that. They don't necessarily have the broader higher ed contacts experience to be able to leverage a network.
Right, exactly. So, when I was chancellor and was charging search committees that were looking for presidents in our institutions, that was a point I hammered at home, that you are truly a search committee. You are the ones that, you know the university, colleagues across the country, you can talk to people, who would be a good fit for this institute. You help generate the pool for the presidency. And I don't think that happens often enough.
No, I think so. Now, it would be interesting to see any statistics. I don't have them. Be interesting to see how long recruiter-based candidates stay on the job versus what you're suggesting with the search committee networking, stay on the job.
Yeah, that would be. It would be. There's a PhD thesis in it for someone.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, these are some of the factors, and we've talked about a lot of things based on your experience, which you've done this a lot longer than most people, definitely longer than the 3.7 years right now that's out there. What advice would you give presidents coming into a presidency? We've talked a little bit about the search, getting on there. Now they've been selected.
Yeah.
What do you tell them?
Well, the onboarding,
yes,
a new president, it's so important, both for the board, the institution to get organized well, but also for the president and how he or she approaches this responsibility. I have two really radically different experiences. I became president of the University of Maryland after being on the faculty for, 28 years or so. And I was the provost. And when I was a faculty member, I'd been on every campus-wide committee there was. I knew people all across the campus. I've been on the campus senate. I knew everybody. I knew the groundskeepers, not all of them, but I knew a lot of them. So, I had a real feel for that institution. When I became the president at College Park, it was quite comfortable. The campus had shown a lot of support for me being the president, and I knew so much about the campus. And so it was sort of a comfortable transition into the presidency. Then I went to Ohio State, this huge university, even bigger than the University of Maryland, where literally I didn't know anybody. Maybe I'd met a few mathematicians or a couple of administrators, but I didn't really know the campus or the culture or anything. So I'm suddenly on this huge campus, and I'm the president of the university, and who do I talk to? Who can I trust? Who's going to tell me the truth, unvarnished truth? I mean, how am I going to get a measure this campus? And, someone must have suggested it to me because it was such a good idea. I'm not going to take credit for it, but it was such a good idea. I went to a colleague, Frank Rhodes, who was just stepping down as the president of Cornell. And I said, Frank, would you come out and be my eyes and ears on the campus? I want you to go out and talk to faculty and staff and students and community members in total confidence. Help me get a feel and the pulse of this institution and its aspirations and its challenges. So Frank did that. He says, I think spent a month and wrote a report for me. And I'm telling you, this was unbelievably valuable. I read this report and I still had a lot of people to meet, but I certainly, when I went out to meet people, I was much better informed about the culture, traditions, interests, challenges, priorities of the institution.
Yeah. And you and I have done this for one major state flagship just a while back, going out and interviewing everybody from the board all the way down to faculty and staff.
Yeah.
And it was very helpful.
Couldn't agree with you more. And, it's sort of driven by that example. But let me go on beyond just the personal side, that is to say, sort of getting inducted into the role within the community. A couple of other things that I think presidents should think long and, carefully about as they move into a presidency. I think one of them is they need to have a very clear understanding with the board about roles and responsibilities. All this intrusion by boards into the president's activities, micromanagement, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there ought to be ground rules from the start that the president can point to and remind people, here's what we agreed upon, here's what you do, and here's what I do. And I don't know, but I don't think enough presidents address that issue as they're coming into they get a contract with the compensation and the buyout clause and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. But there ought to be great clarity around that point. I can't overstress how important that is. And I think a president also needs to insist upon an annual review by the board so that there is some record of what is it the board wanted done, how successful was the president doing it. So there's an evaluation. So there's a written record. You can't sort of come back and invent things and do revisionist history.
And that happens? Well, you and I have dealt with this multiple times. Right. Both of these things, presidents not getting evaluations on a timely basis. Yeah. And as far as going back in roles and responsibilities, it's in today's world, you've got to have that understanding between what's my job, what's your job.
Right. Finally, and I just can't overstate how important the respect for shared governance and consultation with representative bodies is for a president. There's pressure coming from the board for action or from the external world to take action and make decisions. And that's got to be resisted. I mean, there may be some rare instances when a president has to sort of take unilateral action, but demonstrating a respect and building the trust and confidence of the community by the commitment to consultation and shared governance is, I think, absolutely critical for any incoming president.
And it can't be just lip service. The most effective shared governance we've both seen have got faculty as voting members, student as voting members on the board. I mean, that's important, but also too, having them as members of your cabinet, having one of the faculty members, maybe the president of the Senate.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of people would argue that deletes the power of the provost. I would disagree. I think it gives faculty the feeling that they have a say where it really means, where it's important.
Yeah. I never had a faculty member on my cabinet, but I feel confident that people would assess my tenure as one where I had great respect for the governance bodies of the faculty, staff, and students, mm-hmm. and regular attender of the Senate meetings, and never took policy decisions to the board without appropriate consultation. So
I agree. So with that, you've got some definite ideas on what an effective shared governance system has as its tenets.
Right. I have given a lot of thought to shared governance, and since even my days as a faculty member when I was on the campus senate, but then being both provost and the president and the chancellor, and thinking long and hard about how to make shared governance work and work effectively. In my mind, there are basically three tiers involved in an effective shared governance system. There's the representative bodies of faculty, staff, and students. Some places they're all rolled into one senate. In others, they're separated. There's a staff senate, there's a faculty senate, there's a student government, et cetera. However, that's tier one. I don't mean this in a hierarchy. I mean, that's one level of shared governance. Then, of course, there's the administration. And that's the second level that plays a role, second tier. And then, of course, there's the governing board, which is the third tier. Now, I think at an institution, there needs to be a pretty clear understanding that the board is the final authority on everything.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they choose to be. They are the legal entity created by the state to run the institution. And they delegate authority, and it places that work well, there's a high delegation of authority. And in particular, the board should delegate authority on matters where they don't have the expertise. Academic curricula, academic appointments, they're not the experts. Now, some boards rubber stamp tenure recommendations, but in some cases they don't rubber stamp them, like we saw in North Carolina and Texas.
Mm-hmm.
But that's got to be an understanding with the board. But the way I see shared governance working effectively is that the board delegates to the president certain authorities, appointment authorities, and for the cabinet. I would even argue for tenure, but some places want the board to. I can understand that. But the guiding principle has to be that any policy decision, any major policy decision that affects one of the campus constituencies, faculty, staff, or students, or in some cases, all of them, there has to first be consultation with the appropriate governance group at tier one and recommendations coming to the president, who then either acts on those or, if it requires board, then refines that recommendation as appropriate in the administration's mind, and then the president takes that to the board and the board acts upon it. So if we would always follow that pattern of consultation with the governance body at tier one, refinement if necessary by the president, and then action, or a refinement and taking to the board for final action. If we do that, then I think that's an effective shared governance system. And certainly the way I've tried to operate in all of the places where I've had CEO responsibility for an institution.
Well, and that goes back to something you and I have spoken about before, the RACI model: responsible, accountable, consult, and inform. There are certain people who are responsible for doing what it is, those who are accountable for making sure it gets done, those that you consult before the decision is made, and those that you inform after the decision's made. Understanding what lane you're traveling in at any given time with whatever constituency, I think, is important.
Absolutely. Yes.
So what are some of the ongoing strategies a president should pursue to be successful?
Yeah. Well, let me mention several things, and this would be at the top of very high on the list. Build a relationship of trust with the board, both collectively and individually. Now, that probably sounds like a homily, but that takes hard work. I cannot tell you how much hard work that requires. A president cannot be successful or build that kind of relationship with the board if the only interaction with the board is when there's a committee meeting or a board meeting. When I was at Ohio State, my staff that helped plan my schedule would build in every week a phone conversation with a board member. And that would rotate through the board over the weeks, so that I was calling up a board member and, just finding out how they're doing, how are things going, any thoughts, any concerns, anything wanted me to know about, whatever. And I don't think a president should ever become friends with board members because there's a relationship there. But we had a very collegial, warm, professional relationship. But it took an enormous investment of time and energy.
Mm-hmm.
I think the second thing that is paramount is the board has to be kept informed on all matters. No surprises should be, there's nothing that the board member should read about in the newspaper, a big story about the university in the newspaper. They've got to know in front. You've seen again and again where that hasn't occurred. That's just so critically important. I think sometimes when a person becomes a president, there is this sense that I'm supposed to be in charge of every conversation and have the ideas that are going to be implemented. I'm the font of vision and direction for the institution. And I think the really successful presidents are ones that are very visible on the campus, very accessible, and are very good listeners. Being a good listener, you might sound like, well, okay, you sit there while somebody talks for a while. But that's not being a good listener. What I mean by being a good listener is you can actually, even if you disagree with the person, you can put yourself in their situation and understand fully why they hold the view they are espousing. If you can do that, then you're a good listener.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're going to build consensus and have strong support over an extended period as a president or chancellor, you've got to have the belief within the community that people can be heard, that you will pay attention to what they have to say. You may not act upon it, but they'll know why you didn't. So that is just such an important quality. And again, that takes an inordinate amount of time. You've got to be out and about on the campus. You got to be willing to have meetings. Let people, at the end of the day, let people come in your office when you're ready to go home and sit and listen and talk. But it's that kind of dynamic that I think can make for a very good president.
It's a 24/7 job, is it not?
It is, yeah. But there's a flip side to that being a good listener that I think makes for an effective president. And that is being decisive. You can't be wishy-washy. I mean, you've listened, you've got to make a decision, you've consulted, make the decision, and then hold to it.
Mm-hmm.
There's a recent example that sort of makes this point in a way, and I don't want to pick on any particular institution because it's a great institution, Northwestern, and they have a very fine president. But in this instance, the president didn't consult and didn't be decisive. It had to do with this terrible scandal now in their intercollegiate athletics program. The president was under enormous pressure to take some kind of action. And so suspended the coach for a period of time, and maybe there was some financial arrangement. Well, there was such egregious behavior within the football program, that wasn't going to fly. So a week later, the president has to come back and fire the coach. So taking a little more time, a little more consultation might have avoided that, the decision and then backing off and making another decision, which made it look like pressure caused the second decision to happen. So, and then the other thing is walk the walk and talk the talk. Your behavior as president has got to emulate the values you're espousing for the institution. I think in these difficult financial times, sometimes boards will give presidents big salary increases or bonuses when other people aren't getting raises, say. President ought to walk away from that money. You got to live the values and practices that you are trying to preach to the institution. So, nobody wants to give bad news or admit a mistake, but my goodness, it's better to do that at the outset, nip it in the bud, and move on, because it'll just come back to haunt you if you in any way you try to paper it over or cover it up by not being completely candid. So those are a few things I've tried to live by in my role as president and chancellor.
Yeah. And, those are really great things. And you've touched on a number of things that can derail a presidency as well. So thank you. I am just amazed this has gone by way more quickly than of course, you and I We work together. We've had great conversations along these lines. To kind of wrap up things, what would you say are 3 key takeaways for universities and presidents' boards? How can we fix this shortened tenure, or can we?
Well, I think it's going to be difficult in the current political world we live in today, but I'm going to cut my 3 down to 2. I think the work and attention to building trust with the board and having a clear understanding of the role and responsibilities, using the best governance practices as the standard, working to have that clear understanding is absolutely essential. It needs to, is that we talked about earlier, it needs to be there from the get-go. It needs to be part of the understanding when you become a president, and it needs to be reinforced on a regular basis through conversations, retreats, whatever, with the board. So the president can't be effective unless they are seen as the operational executive for the institution without intrusion by the board. As soon as the board starts undercutting the president anyway, the president loses credibility and effectiveness. So I think that's job 1, is to build that sense of trust and a clear understanding of the role and responsibilities. And then I think the other thing is this building the trust and relationship with the university's constituents, its alumni, its donors, but most especially its faculty, staff, and students. Being visible, being accessible, being a good listener, and being candid and forthright in all communication. I think if a president can accomplish those 2 things, they have a very good chance of having a long and successful tenure.
Very good. Thank you for those. I mean, those are excellent. Britt, what's next for you besides us working together on more projects?
Well, I still remain, despite my advancing years, very involved in lots of ways. I do a fair amount of consulting, as you know. I had the privilege of chairing a major commission for the state on reforming pre-K through 12 education. So I've now moved from higher education down to pre-K through 12.
You're going backwards? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. And so we have a grand plan in Maryland that's been embraced by the General Assembly. And I'm on a board that's overseeing the implementation of it. And then I'm on the university's hospital board. I'm enjoying that thoroughly. I'm now a board member and evaluating the CEO rather than being evaluated by board members. So I'm enjoying that role. So I stay plenty busy and still find time to play a fair amount of tennis.
Yeah, for somebody, I don't want to say at the advanced years you are, which is what you said, but for somebody like you, being out on the courts 4 or 5 times a week and playing singles is quite the accomplishment.
Well, I'm enjoying life. I had a great experience in higher education. Wouldn't change my career path in any way, shape, or form. Though I'm in my sunset years, I'm still involved and engaged and enjoying what I'm doing.
Well, very good. Question for you. Are you going to go up to the U.S. Open and watch some tennis this year?
I've been there. Last year I went to the French Open.
Oh, wow.
Maybe I was not as a player.
Not senior division?
No, not even that. But I did go to the French. So I've now been to the Wimbledon, I've been to the French, and I've been to the U.S. Open. My bucket list has one more to tick off, the Australian.
Very good. Well, I wish you all the best of luck in getting there. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a real pleasure.
Drumm, it's always a joy to be with you.
Likewise, sir. Thank you. Thanks for listening, and a special thank you to our guest, Dr. William Britt Kerwin, for his sharing his perspectives on presidential turnover and what can be done to change the trajectory of presidential tenure. Britt, thank you. It's always a pleasure working with you and having you on the show. Tune in next week as we welcome back Amy Prevet-Perko, CEO of the Knight Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics, who'll be joining us to talk about NIL, conference realignment, and what college presidents can do to influence the influx of big dollars into collegiate athletics. Thanks again for listening. See you next week.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.